AITA for not taking my daughter's iPad even though the woman on the plane made her hide it because her son saw it and wanted the iPad and the woman was against it. I was on a flight with my 3-year-old daughter, heading off to visit family, something we do a couple of times a year. Flying with a toddler can be tricky, but by now, I've got it down to a bit of a science. I've learned that the key to a peaceful flight lies in the preparation. So, like any seasoned parent, I had meticulously packed our carry-on with all the essentials, snacks that wouldn't make a mess, her favorite blanket for comfort, a couple of small toys, and, most importantly, her iPad. That iPad is like a miracle worker loaded with her favorite shows, some educational games, and a couple of apps she's obsessed with. It's basically my golden ticket to a quiet, tantrum-free flight. As we boarded the plane, I spotted a family settling in across the aisle from us. They had a little boy who looked to be about the same age as my daughter. He had that wide-eyed, curious look that toddlers often have when they're taking in a new environment. I didn't think much of it as we found our seats and got ourselves situated. My daughter, already a seasoned traveler in her own right, was eager to get her hands on the iPad. I got her settled in her seat, handed her a snack, and as soon as the seatbelt sign was off, I handed her the iPad and put on her little pink headphones. She was instantly engrossed, completely absorbed in whatever show was playing. I breathed a sigh of relief. This was the part of the flight I always looked forward to, those precious moments of calm when she's quietly entertained, and I can relax, maybe even read a book or just enjoy the flight without worrying about keeping her occupied. But it didn't take long for the tranquility to be shattered. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that the little boy across the aisle had spotted my daughter's iPad. He was staring at it like it was the most fascinating thing in the world, his little face lighting up as he tugged on his mom's sleeve, pointing at the screen with that unmistakable look of longing. I could almost hear the silent plea in his eyes. I want that. His mom, to her credit, leaned down and whispered something to him. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to understand that she was telling him no. Something about how they weren't using iPads on this trip, and that he should focus on something else. I watched as his face fell, that excited gleam in his eyes quickly replaced by disappointment. And then, as if on cue, the tears started to well up. He let out a small whimper, and before I knew it, that whimper had escalated into full-blown crying. Not just the kind of crying that you can shush with a quick distraction, no, this was the kind of crying that said, I'm not going to stop until I get what I want. My daughter was completely oblivious to the commotion. She was still glued to her iPad, munching on her snack, lost in her own little world. I, on the other hand, was acutely aware of the drama unfolding next to us. The boys' cries were getting louder, and I could feel the tension starting to build. I put on my own headphones, not because I was listening to anything, but because I was trying to block out the noise. I just wanted to get through this flight with my sanity intact. But it quickly became clear that the boy's parents were struggling. His mom was trying her best to calm him down, but every time she told him no, the crying only intensified. His dad was looking increasingly frustrated, glancing over at us with a look that I could only describe as a mix of desperation and annoyance. I tried to focus on my daughter, hoping that the situation would resolve itself, but the crying just kept going, and I could feel the weight of their stares. After what felt like an eternity, the mom finally got my attention. She leaned over, trying to maintain a polite tone, but I could hear the strain in her voice. "Excuse me," she said, a tight smile on her face. "We're not allowing our son to use his iPad on this vacation. Would it be okay if your daughter put hers away?" I blinked, momentarily stunned by the request. I mean, I understood where she was coming from. Her kid was having a meltdown, and she was clearly at her wit's end. But at the same time, I couldn't help but think, why should my daughter have to give up her iPad because of the rules you set for your kid? It didn't seem fair to make my daughter, who was perfectly content and well-behaved, put away the one thing that was keeping her calm and happy just to appease someone else's child. I looked at the mom, trying to be as understanding as possible, and said, "I'm really sorry, but no. My daughter's using it, and it's keeping her settled. I hope you understand." The look she gave me was anything but understanding. It was more like a mix of disbelief and anger, as if she couldn't believe I had just refused her request. She didn't say anything else, just turned back to her son, who, by this point, was crying so hard his little face was turning red. I couldn't believe the audacity of the request. I mean, I've heard of people asking for a lot of things on flights, switching seats, trading snacks, even quieting down a bit, but asking someone else to put away their child's entertainment to appease a crying kid, that was a first. But I kept my cool. I knew she was probably overwhelmed and exhausted, just like any parent on a flight with a toddler. Still, it wasn't my responsibility to manage her child's disappointment, especially not at the expense of my own daughter's peace. As I settled back into my seat, I could feel the tension radiating from the other side of the aisle. The boy's crying hadn't let up. In fact, it was getting louder. His face was scrunched up in frustration, tears streaming down his cheeks as he continued to eye my daughter's iPad with that desperate longing. His mom was trying to shush him, alternating between whispering soothing words and scolding him under her breath. But nothing was working. Every time she tried to distract him with something else, he'd push it away, his gaze fixed on the screen in my daughter's hands. I tried to focus on my book, but it was impossible to ignore the growing commotion. My daughter was still completely absorbed in her show, blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. I was grateful for that small mercy. The last thing I needed was for her to get upset too. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the woman leaned over again. This time, there was no pretense of politeness. Her tight smile had vanished, replaced by a look of thinly veiled irritation. She didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Look," she said, her voice clipped and tense, "I've already asked nicely. My son is very upset, and it's because he sees your daughter playing with that iPad. We're on a family vacation, and we've decided not to let him use screens. It's really unfair to him that your daughter gets to have hers out in plain sight." I could feel my patience wearing thin. It was one thing to ask politely, but now she was practically demanding that I cater to her parenting choices. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice calm and even. I understand that it's hard for him, but my daughter is settled and quiet, and the iPad is keeping her that way. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to take it away from her. The woman's face reddened, her frustration boiling over. "So, you're just going to let my son cry for the rest of the flight?" she snapped, her voice rising a little too loud. "Do you have any idea how hard this is for us? You could at least try to be considerate." I felt my own temper start to flare. "I am being considerate," I replied, my voice firm. "I'm being considerate of my daughter's needs. I'm sorry that your son is upset, but I'm not going to take away the one thing that's keeping my child calm just because you decided to go screen-free on your vacation. That's a choice you made, and I shouldn't have to inconvenience my daughter because of it." The woman glared at me, clearly not satisfied with my response. She muttered something under her breath that I couldn't quite catch, but I got the gist of it. She was angry, and she wasn't going to let this go. For a moment, I thought she might try to argue with me further, but instead, she turned sharply in her seat, pressing the call button above her head. I could feel my heart rate pick up as I realized she was calling the flight attendant over. Great, this was exactly what I needed. It wasn't long before the flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with a kind but weary smile, appeared beside us. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her eyes flicking between me, the woman, and the still crying boy. The other mom didn't waste a second. "No, everything is not okay," she said, her voice laced with frustration. "My son is very upset because he sees this little girl playing with her iPad, and we're trying to limit screen time on this trip. I asked this woman if she could put the iPad away, but she refused, and now my son has been crying for almost an hour." The flight attendant turned to me, her expression neutral but clearly waiting for my side of the story. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "My daughter is using her iPad to stay calm during the flight," I explained. "She's 3 years old, and this is what works for us to keep her settled. I'm sorry that it's upsetting her son, but I don't think it's fair to ask us to put it away because of their decision to go screen-free." The flight attendant nodded, her expression thoughtful. She turned back to the other mom, her tone polite but firm. "Ma'am, I understand that your son is upset, but other passengers are allowed to use their devices during the flight. If it's causing an issue, you might consider giving your son something to distract him, whether that's a toy, a book, or even allowing him to use a screen if that would help calm him down. The woman looked aghast, as if the mere suggestion of giving her son a screen was offensive. "But we're on vacation," she insisted, her voice rising in pitch. "We're trying to have a screen-free experience. It's not fair that my son has to watch another child play with an iPad when he can't have his own." The flight attendant maintained her composure, but I could see the hint of exasperation in her eyes. "I understand your concern, Mom, but as I said, other passengers are within their rights to use their devices. If you're set on not allowing your son to use a screen, then I'm afraid you'll need to find another way to keep him occupied. There's really nothing more I can do in this situation." The woman opened her mouth to argue, but the flight attendant cut her off, her tone still polite but with an edge of finality. "I can bring you some extra coloring books or crayons if that would help, but I'm afraid I can't ask another passenger to put away their device." The woman stared at her, clearly frustrated and not getting the answer she wanted. Finally, she let out a huff of breath, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Fine," she muttered, glaring at me one last time before turning back to her son, "but this is just ridiculous." The flight attendant gave me a sympathetic smile before heading off to assist another passenger. I watched her go, feeling a mix of relief and lingering tension. The boy's crying had died down to soft whimpers, but he was still clearly unhappy, and his mom was doing her best to console him with little success. I could feel the eyes of other passengers on us, the air thick with the unspoken judgment that hung in the cabin. As the flight dragged on, the tension between me and the woman across the aisle simmered, but I tried my best to ignore it. I put on my headphones, hoping to drown out the faint, pitiful cries of her son that were still seeping through. My daughter was still content, her little fingers tapping away at the iPad as she watched her show. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was working for us, and I wasn't about to change things now. But apparently, my attempt to block out the situation wasn't going unnoticed. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of the woman out of the corner of my eye, still shooting me dirty looks, her frustration growing more palpable by the minute. Her son was exhausted by this point, his cries a little softer but still persistent. I could tell she was nearing the end of her rope, but I was determined not to let her problem become mine. Suddenly, I noticed her unbuckling her seatbelt. For a second, I thought she might be getting up to take her son to the restroom or to walk him up and down the aisle, but she didn't head toward the front of the plane. Instead, she stood up, picked up her son, and started walking directly toward me. My stomach sank as I realized what she was doing, but before I could react, she was standing right next to my seat, her son now wailing directly in my ear. I could feel the vibrations of his cries through the seat, and even with my headphones on, the sound was almost unbearable. I looked up at her, my eyes wide with shock, but she just stood there, glaring down at me, as if daring me to do something about it. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. I could feel the eyes of other passengers on us, the air in the cabin growing thick with the tension. My heart was pounding, and I could feel my patience, what little of it was left, finally snap. I yanked off my headphones, my voice sharp as I looked up at her. "What the hell are you doing? Are you out of your mind?" Her eyes blazed with anger as she leaned down, her voice dripping with venom. "This wouldn't be happening if you had just put the damn iPad away. My son wouldn't be crying, and we could all be having a peaceful flight. But no, you had to be selfish and let your daughter keep playing, and now you're going to listen to him cry until we land. No more headphones for you." I was absolutely floored by her audacity. Was this woman really standing here, holding her screaming child over me, trying to force me to listen to his cries as some sort of twisted punishment? I could hardly believe what was happening. My daughter, who had been oblivious to the situation until now, looked up at the scene unfolding next to her with wide, frightened eyes. The sight of her scared face pushed me over the edge. I stood up, my voice slow and controlled, but laced with anger. "You need to step away right now," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "I'm not responsible for your child's behavior. I'm not responsible for your parenting choices. And I'm certainly not going to let you harass me and my daughter because you don't like the fact that we're using an iPad. This is completely out of line." She didn't back down. If anything, she seemed even more emboldened by my response. "Out of line," she spat, you're the one who's out of line. You think you can just do whatever you want and ignore everyone else around you. My son is crying because of you and your selfishness. You should be ashamed of yourself, and now, you're going to listen to every single one of his cries, because this is what you deserve." The flight attendant, who had clearly been keeping an eye on the situation, rushed over. Her expression was a mix of concern and exasperation as she stepped between us, trying to diffuse the escalating confrontation. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," she said firmly, addressing the woman. "This behavior is completely unacceptable. If you don't return to your seat immediately, I will have to take further action." The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she glared at the flight attendant. For a moment, I thought she might refuse, but then she let out a frustrated huff and turned away, still clutching her sobbing son. As she made her way back to her seat, she shot me one last venomous look, as if to say, "This isn't over." I sank back into my seat, my heart still racing from the confrontation. My daughter was staring up at me, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. I forced myself to take a deep breath, reaching over to stroke her hair in an attempt to reassure her. "It's okay, sweetie," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Everything's okay." But it wasn't okay, not really. I could still hear the woman's son crying, even from across the aisle, and the tension in the cabin was thick. The flight attendant stayed nearby for a few minutes, keeping a watchful eye on the situation, but eventually, she had to move on to tend to other passengers. As the flight continued, the tension seemed to settle, at least momentarily. The woman's son, exhausted from his prolonged tantrum, eventually calmed down. His cries dwindled to tired whimpers, and he finally settled into his mother's arms, sniffling quietly. The noise that had filled the cabin for what felt like an eternity was replaced by the low hum of the plane's engines and the occasional rustle of passengers adjusting in their seats. But while the boy had calmed down, his mother clearly had not. She sat stiffly in her seat, her jaw clenched, and I could see her glancing over at me every so often, her eyes full of unresolved anger. I tried to ignore her, focusing instead on my daughter, who was still blissfully absorbed in her iPad. The show she was watching kept her completely entertained, her little giggles occasionally breaking the silence. It was a small relief in the otherwise tense atmosphere. I had hoped that the woman would let it go, that she would realize there was no point in continuing this ridiculous feud over an iPad. But, of course, that was too much to ask. Not long after her son had quieted down, she leaned across the aisle again. This time, her voice was a harsh whisper, her words laced with bitterness. "You know, this could have been avoided if you had just put the iPad away," she hissed. "You think you're a good mother because you let your daughter do whatever she wants, but all you're doing is raising a selfish child. You should have some consideration for others." I felt my stomach twist with anger. I had already made it clear that I wasn't going to put the iPad away, and her persistence was grating on my last nerve. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady as I responded. "I'm not going to keep explaining this to you. My daughter is behaving just fine, and she's not the one causing problems. Your parenting choices are your own, but don't try to impose them on me or my child." She opened her mouth to retort, but I turned away, effectively ending the conversation. I could hear her huff in frustration, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to get into a pointless argument with someone who clearly had no intention of seeing reason. The remainder of the flight was a delicate balancing act of trying to maintain my calm while ignoring the woman's continued attempts to engage me. She made several more snide comments, each one more pointed than the last, but I refused to take the bait. I kept my focus on my daughter, who was blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. She was happy, and that was all that mattered to me. Finally, after what felt like the longest 2 hours of my life, the plane began its descent. The usual announcements were made, and passengers started preparing for landing. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing that this ordeal was almost over. My daughter, noticing the change in the plane's altitude, put her iPad away without any prompting, excitedly looking out the window as we approached the ground. But even as we descended, the woman wasn't done. As she buckled her son into his seat for landing, she leaned over one last time. "You've taught your daughter nothing but selfishness today. I hope you're proud," she said, her voice low but filled with venom. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. I just wanted to get off the plane and put this whole mess behind me. When the seatbelt sign finally turned off, there was a collective sigh of relief from the passengers, and everyone began to stand up and gather their belongings. I quickly helped my daughter with her small backpack and took her hand, ready to leave as quickly as possible. But as we slowly made our way down the aisle, I noticed the woman and her son were right behind us. My heart sank, realizing that she wasn't going to let this go, even after we'd left the plane. Sure enough, as soon as we stepped into the jet bridge, she was there again, her son trailing behind her. She caught up to us, and without any pretense of politeness, she began her tirade. "You really are unbelievable," she spat. "I don't know what kind of world you live in where you think it's okay to be so inconsiderate. I can't believe you're just walking away like you've done nothing wrong." I stopped in my tracks and turned to face her, my patience finally worn thin. My daughter, sensing the tension, gripped my hand a little tighter and looked up at me with wide, worried eyes. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I knew I needed to keep my cool for my daughter's sake. "Listen," I said, my voice firm but controlled. "I've explained myself multiple times, and I'm done with this conversation. We're not going to agree on this, and that's fine. But you need to stop harassing me and my daughter. This has gone on long enough." She glared at me, clearly unsatisfied with my response. "Harassing you? You've got some nerve. You're the one who ruined my son's flight, and now you're acting like the victim. Maybe if you'd put half as much effort into teaching your daughter some manners as you do defending her bad behavior, we wouldn't be having this conversation." I felt a flash of heat in my cheeks, my anger flaring up again. "My daughter's behavior isn't the issue here," I shot back. "The issue is that you're trying to make your problem my responsibility. I'm sorry your son had a rough flight, but that's not my fault, and it's not my daughter's fault either. We did what was best for us, and that's the end of it." She shook her head, her expression filled with disdain. "You're a real piece of work, you know that? I hope you never have to deal with someone as selfish as you've been today. Maybe then you'll realize how awful you've been." I could see other passengers glancing over at us as they walked by, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me, but I stood my ground. "I'm done with this," I said firmly. "I'm not going to stand here and argue with you anymore. You can think whatever you want about me, but that doesn't change anything. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to get going." With that, I turned and began walking again, my daughter holding tightly to my hand.